Hello and welcome. I'm Shannon Stefani, head of the Michigan District Council of the Urban Land Institute. On behalf of ULI, I'd like to welcome you to this virtual meeting and express how much we all hope that you are well and safe during this unprecedented time. I hope that this call will go smoothly, but I also hope you will forgive us any hiccups that may occur as we learn how to use this technology in a more expanded capacity than we ever have before. We've already set the default for all of you to be muted for the majority of this meeting, and we ask that you also disable your video for the duration of the presentations in order to ensure that we have proper bandwidth. This meeting's presentation is being recorded, and we will share the presentation on our website soon after. In just a few moments, I'll turn it over to our speakers to start, but wanted to share the format of this meeting to ensure that we can maximize everyone's time. Victoria will be monitoring the chat for questions that you may have throughout the presentations, and we've reserved the last third of the meeting for a robust question and answer session with our speakers and with each other. So you can enter in your questions at any time throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait for the question and answer period of time. And when it comes to questions and answers, please allow Victoria to call on you to unmute and ask your questions during that time. With that, I will turn it over to Karen Burton to give the chair's welcome on behalf of Jill Ferrari as a part of the Detroit Commercial Real Estate Share the Mic hashtag. Karen has agreed to co-chair ULI Michigan's Pathways for Inclusion initiative and to welcome you all from ULI Michigan. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this discussion on restructuring the deal. Again, as Shannon said, I'm Karen Burton, one of the new co-chairs for ULI Michigan's Pathways to Inclusion program. I'm also co-founder and CEO of Space Lab Detroit, a shared office and co-working and meeting space with 2 locations in the city. Many of our members are built environment professionals. You probably thought you'd be seeing Jill Ferrari, one of our ULI Michigan Advisory Board chairs, and you see her here on the screen. Well, Jill is sharing the mic with me. We're doing Share the Mic Now, and Jill has created a hashtag also, Share the Mic Now Detroit CRE. She reached out to me for this special informal initiative to inspire white women and Black women to share their social media platforms, networks, and connections, and to broaden our reach. We hope it will inspire other women to do the same. I appreciate you, Jill, for doing this with me. Again, our webinar today is how we can use capital stacks and how they're being structured now during COVID-19. We have lending representatives from the state level, CDFIs, and private lenders. So we thank you again for joining us today. And I'm handing the mic over now to Mitch Rochelle. Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you very much, Karen. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. I figured since many of you know me as the emerging trends in real estate person, I would talk about a few trends that we're seeing. And stepping back for a second, somebody way smarter than me had commented, and I think it was somebody from the Hoover Institution, that in periods of crises, and I don't think there's any debate amongst us that we're in a period of crises, if not multiple crises, in periods of crisis, pre-existing trends get hyper-accelerated. So what I figured I'd do is talk about a few of the trends that I've talked with you about in the past and talk about how they've been hyper-accelerated. The first one is working remotely. Excuse me. If you go back a couple of years ago, I think when I presented in Detroit for the first time, one of the things I talked about was optionality and how in space we wanted flexibility to work, maybe work, live, and play in the same space, in the same environment. And one of the things that's happened is we went from that operating model to working from home, as I am right now, as you all probably are right now, literally in a matter of days. In my office in New York, I'll never forget this. I think it was May 11th. I came into New York City. I had a new employee starting. I wanted to take her out to lunch. I had a couple of things I had to do. I was not in the office. Actually, I was in the office. That was a Tuesday. I was in the office the previous day. We had lunch. I did a few things, and then I went home. For the rest of the week, I actually worked remotely because I do a combination of working in the office and working remotely. And by Friday, I sort of had an emergency call with my team to give everybody the flexibility of working remotely. By that Monday, my firm nationally made the decision that we were all going to work remotely. Literally a decision that was made on a Friday. It was just an option for our people. By Monday, it was mandatory. So we had to literally take our entire workforce and work remotely, and we weren't alone. Basically, most of the office using workforce across the country went from being in the office or a combination of office and remote to exclusively remote. What's interesting and why I bring it up now is, as a trend, I think that, and one of the things we're hearing in the research that we're doing for Emerging Trends 2021, is that operating model may be more of a go forward strategy than it is just a temporary one. What's interesting is when we interview CEOs and CFOs, not just in the real estate space, and we ask the question, do you think you need more space or less space going forward? The answer to that question has been yes, meaning some people say more and some people say less. But I think the built environment as it relates to many of our uses is going to get incredibly disrupted. So that whole notion of working remotely is something that we were seeing as a trend, and that trend got hyper accelerated. The next trend I wanted to pivot to is something I think I talked about for the first time 2 years ago when we met, which is we were beginning to see this trend. Well, stepping back a little bit, a bigger mega trend that we had observed in emerging trends several years ago was one of urbanization. More and more people, multiple generations moving back to cities, walkability being very important. A city's walk score became very relevant in terms of whether or not companies would relocate there, whether or not people would move there. And clearly urbanization seemed to be a force of nature. One of the trends we also observed recently in the last few years was how the millennial generation was beginning to show signs of moving out of urban settings and moving towards the suburbs. They were doing that for a variety of reasons, but we were beginning to see it, and we were seeing enough of it that we thought it was noteworthy. That trend's been hyper accelerated as families with young children, couples looking to start families are getting more and more concerned about the density of urban areas and whether or not it's appropriate to try to raise a family or to even live with or without children in urban areas. And we're seeing this hyper accelerated trend of moving out of cities towards the suburbs. The next trend I wanted to talk about, and I'm going to try and bring all these together and then turn it over to the other speakers for their intros, and then pivot into some Q&A in the second half of this. The other trend we started to see is one where retail was having a hard time, brick and mortar retail that is, was having a hard time coexisting with e-commerce. That's not a news grabbing headline. Certainly everybody's observed that, and it's something we've probably been talking about in real estate for about a decade. However, when you shut down brick and mortar retail, which is basically what happened in varying degrees across all 50 states, and you supercharge e-commerce is really the only way of consuming retail goods, with a few exceptions. We've really sort of hyper accelerated that trend. And what we're seeing more and more is a realignment of what do we need in retail, what do we need in terms of stores Do we have too much space? Are we overbuilt and perhaps under demolished? What does the last mile look like? Interestingly enough, many of us pay for Prime service. Interestingly enough, Prime service was, a way to get faster delivery and not pay that incremental deliveries charge on a purchase by purchase basis. Little did we know, but that Prime would be our salvation, as it was one more platform for us to stream stuff because we had watched everything we wanted to watch on Netflix. So it opened up a whole new pathway for more digital content. But in all seriousness, we've really sort of hyper accelerated that trend and put brick and mortar retail on its heels to figure out very, very quickly, how can it coexist with e-commerce, and what is brick and mortar's role relative to e-commerce's role. The last thing that sort of may cut across all those trends, and I'll wrap with this, is healthcare. What's interesting is this health crisis really put a sharp focus on the way in which healthcare is delivered from a physical plant perspective. In many cases across the country, elective surgeries were sort of discontinued. We did everything we could to free up hospital capacity because we didn't know how many hospital beds we could potentially need. And the physical building of the hospital became a super sterile environment. What's interesting is, prior to that, one of the trends that we began to observe was how brick and mortar retail was becoming part of the pathway for healthcare delivery. We're seeing like drugstore retailers actually having urgent care facilities in them. We're seeing more and more urgent care popping up in strip centers. We're seeing more specialty healthcare popping up in strip centers. And this is something that was happening before. What's interesting, and what is going to happen more and more as a result of this hyperacceleration, is a shift of some functions that were in the hospital to become a land use within suburbia, within urban settings outside of the hospital. So if you sort of cut through all of these things, we have people moving out of cities. We have offices sort of taking their workforce and putting them remotely. We're starting to see more and more interest in suburban office as a way for CBD tenants to push their actual offices closer to where people live. We're seeing retail be transformed, and we're seeing healthcare become a bigger and bigger land use. So those are the sort of the top themes, a little bit of a sneak peek into emerging trends 2021 as we're doing the interviews and research. But I figured the time was appropriate, since I had this captive audience, to share with you some of those insights and perhaps use those as a foundation for the discussion that we'll get into about how the capital stack may be disrupted, and how financing in the public sector and the private sector may change. With that, I believe the slide gets changed, and I'm turning it over to Michelle for her to introduce herself and give a little bit of perspective on from MEDC. Michelle, take it away.
Thanks, Mitch. As he mentioned, I'm Michelle Wildman. I'm the Senior Vice President for Community Development at the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. As I talk, I'm just going to show a few slides along the way. The Michigan Economic Development Corporation is, of course, comprehensive economic development engine for the state of Michigan. We're focused on business attraction, community vitality, and image around the premise that place needs business, talent needs place, and business needs talent. We could go to slide 3. In community development, which is what I'm going to focus on, a few of the resources that we have that are most real estate centric. We do have a comprehensive array of community development programs that include technical assistance, small business funding, and TA, but going to talk today about a few of the tools that we use in real estate primarily. The CRP, or Community Revitalization Program, is one that provides gap financing. It's need-based and competitive. It's an annual appropriation from the legislature. It is a shared pool of dollars. In community development, we're mostly focused on that place of that those three bubbles that you saw at the beginning. But we do share that with our business development program, and really believe that those two things go hand in hand. And we do grants, direct loans, loan participations, as well as equity investments. Go to the next slide. I'll talk about our role as the administrator for the non-environmental aspects of the Brownfield Act 381. This is a tool that reimburses brownfield-related costs for redeveloping contaminated, functionally obsolete, blighted, or historic properties. We do the non-environmental aspects. Eagle does the environmental aspects. It can be commercial, industrial, and residential, and we do see all of those project types. If we can go to the next slide, this visual shows a little bit of how the tool works, really relying on that increment or increase in property value to provide reimbursements to fund the array of activities that I just discussed. Go to the next slide, and the third one that I'll talk about today, or just mention, is Community Development Block Grant. These of course are federal dollars. They come from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. We are the grantee for the Balance Estate. There are entitlement communities, of course, that get their own pot, so we do the balance of those counties for the state of Michigan. Another shared pot with business development. This, of course, comes with all the cross-cutting federal requirements, as well as the need to meet a national objective. One of those being job creation, hence we see these used in business development as well, but our focus really is on those housing, blight elimination, and some of the infrastructure related projects that are critical to community development locally. Not surprising, if we can go to the next slide, over the last 3 months, we've been responding quickly and with a series of I'll call them pivots in some of our programming, where we were trying to provide relief through a variety of mechanisms, everything from grants that allowed manufacturers to retool for the creation of PPE supplies to one of the things we did on the community development side is evolved our Match on Main program, which was a tool we used for main streets and commercial corridors and downtowns to help with business expansion. We pivoted that and provided supports for small businesses to frankly provide capital so that they could continue to thrive during the period of closure. So an array of COVID-related responses there that as of the end of May, and there's even been a few more investments since then, had assisted 3,100 companies in all 83 Michigan counties. If we can go to the next slide, this is sort of the timeline, and you can see where we launched that. We used a lot of, and really appreciative of our partners that helped with this, whether they were the economic development entities throughout the state or the number of CDFIs that helped with our work. It was a heavy lift, and we continue to be grateful for those partnerships that made it possible. That is all for me, and so I will turn it over to our next speaker to introduce herself.
Good day, everyone. Tasha Tabron here. I am a 20-year banking and community development professional. I've been fortunate to serve in roles where I can be creative and mobilize money to help build neighborhood markets and their dynamics. And I've done that with supporting minority developers and women-owned enterprises. And I'm fortunate right now to be in a role as a Senior Vice President at Invest Detroit, and where we align philanthropic and loan capital to support emerging developers. So just an introduction to IDF before I jump into those slides. It's a 25-year-old mission-driven lender. We're celebrating our 25th birthday. Really excited about that this year. We're an investor as well as a partner with a number of other CDFI groups across Michigan, as well as, and that's basically for us to ignite real estate projects and do it in a way that is catalytic in neighborhoods in Detroit. The goal there again is really to look at real estate, look at venture money, look at commercial loans in a way that helps us increase density and promote job creation and support all of that within a neighborhood context, and also do that in a way that's strategic and inclusive. The work we started was in the downtown area and midtown area. Most people know us as a lender in the downtown area, as a mezzanine financer. But we expanded our work, and the first slide talks about this, into 10 areas across the city of Detroit through a neighborhood initiative called the Strategic Neighborhood Fund. And that fund is a five-year, $250 million investment initiative. We are in partnership with an organization called LISC Detroit to bring affordable housing options and work in commercial corridors in a way that's concentrated and catalytic, and hopefully in a way that lifts the market dynamics in those neighborhoods. So if you go to, I think, the second slide, this is what I wanted to kind of emphasize this as we talk about capital stacks across this conversation. What we saw before we saw closures in the neighborhoods related to COVID, in a very functional environment, you would have a very, a very simple complex, a simple capital stack, which is the one on the far left that shows, bank financing and equity into a project. What we saw in most of the Detroit market and in the downtown market as we started to move our subsidies into the neighborhoods is you had some equity financing, you had banks and maybe a CDFI partner, and then at the top of the stack you had another CDFI partner that kind of filled the capital stack for our projects. And that was a market that was starting to emerge and actually do better after a number of years of subsidy. So you think about the Midtown market, it used to be the university district before we started to have all of the universities and other partners begin to build that market up 15 years ago. Now we're moving our investments into the neighborhoods, and we're seeing the same types of difficulties in completing projects as we did before the downtown market was mature, which is there's a gap in the marketplace where there's no matter how much we think rents may move, there's still a need for development costs, where development costs are way exceed what we think will be the maturity of rents in that marketplace. And we're seeing those gaps be as high as 50% into a project. And this was the environment before COVID in March, right? So our expectation going forward is that, there will still be depressed market rents. There will be significant gaps in projects, and our performers are going to, actually see those 50 and 60% gaps in projects going forward. So we still require long-term patient capital, and we're looking at Michelle because most of the projects that we focused on in the city of Detroit required her CRP dollars, and we were a bridge financer for those projects. We have no expectation that going into the next 6 to 12 month cycle that our projects are not going to require those dollars when they needed them on the first end of those projects beforehand. So MEDC, our other CDFI partners who have patient capital to put in projects, are going to be required to deliver projects for us in the future. Key component for us. And then the last thing I'll say is the SNF investment is a partnership among a number of philanthropic partners, both from banks and as well as foundations that understood that the depressed market rates that were in place before COVID, and they have been extremely flexible with us in how we deploy those dollars into the marketplace, because we think that we've provided some solutions for our clients in this short term, and I'll talk about a couple of those in a minute. But we expect that there's going to be a second wave of need for our real estate partners who have projects under construction at this point in time now that haven't actually seen the effects of what it's going to be for their projects as they try to stabilize. And those dollars that we have in place that are long-term, patient, deeply subordinated capital will be a need for them going in the future. I'll close by just sharing a couple of things that we did for our clients in this environment, expecting. Well, that's just a map of some of the neighborhoods, just so you know which neighborhoods we moved to. But I'll close by just sharing some of the things that we provided to our clients in this environment and preparing ourselves for the next wave of what will need to be happening in the capital space. Immediately, what we did for our small business clients was provide automatic deferrals for all of our small businesses and venture partners. So you had to opt out if you didn't need a deferral. We knew that that would be something that would be that you're not without operations up and running. The next thing we provided for our real estate clients was a stabilization fund, thanks to our partners. And it was designed to help those 10 neighborhoods and projects in those neighborhoods, not all of which were clients. We actually helped about 100 applicants, provided about $8,000 in rewards on an average basis for each one of those. And that was to defer rents to their tenants. So this was a landlord program for rent relief for their tenants. And we wanted to make sure that we try to stabilize some of those projects going forward. And I'm sure that some of our other CDFI partners saw the same thing, where under projects under construction, they have pretty healthy rent reserves or interest reserves and we're very conservative about buffering those projects. We had the same situation. So again, we expect that those projects are going to need something on the longer term in the next 10 to 12 months as they start to see what their projections really qualify as. And then the last thing I would say is for that, we also prepared through just deferrals on a one-time, on a case-by-case basis on deferrals for our projects that were stabilized. We allow for deferrals on loans. And again, we're looking at the next wave of what that'll be coming up in the next 10 to 12 months. So with that, I'll turn it over to our next speaker.
There's Barry. Perfect. Take it away.
My name is Barry Swatzenberg. I've been in the investment real estate business for over 20 years, actually closer to 25. We transact on about $500 million worth of real estate a year. At any given time, we're probably valuing another $750 million of real estate, predominantly Michigan, Ohio, Indiana. And, through that process, very active with the lending side of the equation when we're taking assets to market and pairing up those opportunities with lenders, coupled with our robust auction platform that we use on 10X. And, what we're seeing from a capital markets perspective is you want to put it in perspective of where we were before COVID versus where we're at today. Prior to COVID, again, food groups, as I go through them, I'm talking about them in the context of both investor demand as well as lender appeal to lend on, and then obviously higher pricing. But prior to COVID, the sweet spot to be for investment product was, core multifamily assets, Class B or better, big box distribution, industrial, which was closely followed by hotels that, although we're starting to have a little bit of an issue on defaults prior to COVID. And then you worked your way into then office, and then retail kind of lagged thereafter outside of grocery anchored. Now that we're kind of trying to get out of COVID, certainly from a transaction perspective, we're seeing a lot of negative view towards retail for a lot of the disruption features that Mitch talked about earlier, unless it's grocery anchored product. So retail is really kind of on the bottom scale of interest level as well as lender appetite. Hospitality, obviously in that same category, just given their impact that they've experienced from COVID and disruption from a business standpoint. For the Metro Detroit area, and certainly again, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, industrial continues to be kind of the hot item. A lot of that also being predicated on, who is the tenant, how have they survived during COVID, how are they performing. You have lots of companies that had the impact of the shutdown, but didn't have an impact as far as their ability to pay rent or perform on site. to a degree that was, potentially devastating, like it was for other tenants. And then it's really office there after that. So when we look at capital stacks for investment product, the big thing to realize is, if you're sizing up a deal today, is that whatever lending you thought was there prior to COVID, it's not back yet. It is starting to get better, but it's not where it was before. We're seeing break-offs of anywhere from 5 to 10% of perceived value on buyers, in some cases 15%. And then on the lender side of the equation, that then translates into lower loan to values, anywhere from 5 to 10% less, a little bit higher interest rate, depending on whether it's bank debt, debt fund money, CMBS, life companies. And then the real big piece, though, that is a variable, is what we refer to as good news money. And that's part of the loan structure associated with dollars for tenant improvements, leasing commissions, things like that, especially if you're looking to reposition a property or lease up an asset. No question that any deals that are going to get done in the next 3 to 6 months, there'll be heavy scrutiny on how those properties have performed, during the COVID period, having been through multiple events, whether it was the financial recession, the .com, RTC, all the different things that have impacted commercial real estate. We are definitely in a crisis. I agree with Mitch's comments out of the gates. It is, but it's a different crisis. It's a crisis of which so many things that were trending somewhat negative, they got their own accelerator by this crisis. And these are things that probably would have taken, 3 to 5 years to play out, for example, in the retail space in particular. So you're seeing an accelerated rate of bankruptcies, impacts to brick and mortar, which obviously has a big impact on the amount of retail supply that's in all the various markets across the country. So I think that, one of the things that will definitely change, if you will, in the next 6 months is just going to be, what is the yield that somebody wants for an asset, and then how does that translate to pricing? I mean, the opposite force in all of this is there's a tremendous amount of what we call dry powder on the sidelines. There's been a tremendous amount of money raised for commercial assets, but we are in this gray space of what is the bid-ask differential in value. And that's both a combination of cost of equity and then what is the lending component going to be for those assets. And I wish it was clear right now. It's not. But one thing that it is it's better than it was 30 days ago. And hopefully, as the world goes back to work, and if we're blessed not to have a resurgence of the COVID that impacts economic growth, we can see a more normalized lending environment play itself out over the next 60 to 90 days, which, that certainty then obviously translates to, both better pricing and then the potential for execution.
Thank you, Barry. So I think at this point, we're going to do a little facilitated chat that I'm moderating. Michelle, since we haven't heard from you in a while, I figured I'd start with you. And I'm curious how, in this environment, sort of picking up on one of the things that Barry touched on, which is the gray area and all of the uncertainty regarding the future, or if forget about the future, just uncertainty regarding the near term. How has underwriting changed? And you can sort of tackle it from two vantage points. One is perhaps just approach in general, if it's changed at all. And then from a assumptions perspective, how hard is it to sort of think through the assumptions that you typically use in an underwriting process, that given the level of uncertainty that we have right now?
So, of course, the themes that you're alluding to, just the uncertainty relative. I mean, we do a gamut of projects, everything from housing to office space to hotels and things of that nature, also placemaking type projects. And so because we are always working with a partner lender we have really seen the need to be increasingly flexible and kind of responding, particularly in those projects that already had commitments from us and that we were trying to help continue to make viable. And so we are constantly looking at and asking both the community as well as questions about market relative to any new investments that we make, because of course we hear, and I had to smile at the beginning when you said the answer that you got on office space was yes to both, because I think I've heard that same yes to both from my chair as well. So it just continuing to look at those for new projects that we take in, and trying to help through milestone extensions. And we've taken projects back for approval because of the need for beefed up reserve requirements that the lender wanted in order to find comfort with housing projects. So definitely the need for flexibility during these times.
Tasha, when you look at your typical capital stack, when there's sort of a public-private partnership, have the private investors that you're dealing with in this sort of post-COVID uncertainty landscape, have they changed the way they're approaching investments, and or are they changing their expectations of outcomes, meaning they're recalibrating what good looks like?
Right. So thank you for the question around capital stacks and our private investors. A number of our investors a number of our projects include emerging developers that already have challenged, balance sheets, and they don't have the equity to put into projects as it is. So a number of neighborhood deals that I work on, we're talking about 5 to 10% equity that are being put into these deals as it is. And now with the challenge of most of them running operating businesses to actually provide those dollars to a project, they're squeezed anyway about, they're looking for us to help them raise the capital in other kinds of ways. So the good thing about Detroit right now is most of the neighborhoods overlap as opportunity zones. So we have the flexibility to tap into that as a resource for our private equity investors to kind of use those projects that are going to be long-term investments for them anyway. They're ready to to invest over the long term. This hiccup is not a big deal for them to invest. So we're seeing some projects where we've got opportunity zones that take up 40 or 50% of the capital stack, and they fill their own gap, knowing that they were in it for the long term anyway. So that's a positive for us. Another thing I just wanted to take this moment to address, as in your opening remarks, you talked about e-commerce as that coinciding of e-commerce and brick and mortar and how they coexist. One of the upticks, and I was reading about this in Cranes the other day, that we're seeing in the Detroit market is a shift to the need for industrial space. So that's a positive trend that has been good for the business, in that we're seeing a need for storage and warehousing and industrial space, and we're assuming that a lot of that is because of the uptick in e-commerce and products coming into the market that need to be distributed. So that has been positive for us, and we've also seen an uptick in the need for affordable housing and people realizing the need to build more affordable products, and how that's going to be a kind of even out of the portfolio, away from some of the retail work that we're doing. We know that that's going to be something that's going to be challenging in our commercial corridors, and there's been an evening out by looking at housing as a way to diversify their funding stream in a project.
Tasha, I want to stay with you for a second since I'm looking at you. It's like just the two of us are talking to each other. But you talked about industrial, and one of my premises is that not only is industrial going to be what it has been, which is this intermediary for the stuff we buy online, right? It goes from wherever it comes from and it ends up in a warehouse and it shows up on my door on a daily basis. But we may see a resurgence of manufacturing in this country. We may see a resurgence in manufacturing in places that used to be big manufacturers like Detroit. And if Congress can get its act together, they will create some incentives for domestic manufacturing to create jobs. Because when you have 19.5 million Americans receiving unemployment benefits as of today, we need to find a way to create jobs. Are you beginning to see any of that? You know, where opportunity zones meet sort of the opportunity and the needs that are out there?
So I will absolutely. So before this COVID pandemic hit us, there was already a deciding factor. We're already making a deciding factor with the city of Detroit to create a strategy around repurposing buildings and industrial use and trying to bring manufacturing back into the city. I think the pressure is on now with the administration and our team and others to make more spaces readily available quickly, because I think there is going to be a resurgence of that. There's been already some indicators that that might be the next wave of investments that come to the city. And so we have to ready our buildings. We don't have the ready space. So we have to prepare ourselves for the influx of desire to do more manufacturing in the city and having the buildings and the capacity to do so.
Thank you for that. We all, regardless of the city, and I have the benefit of traveling virtually across the country, that seems to be a recurring theme in job creation, hoping that some form of manufacturing or assembly will replace many of the jobs in the service sector, the restaurant jobs, and the other jobs in the service sector that have been lost. Barry, just coming back to you, you talked about the gray space a little bit, and I want to drill back down on that. I had a call earlier today with a very large CMBS lender, and they talked about the uncertainties in the underwriting process, sort of the question that I asked Michelle earlier. And I'm curious, in the work that you're doing, what's being done to sort of navigate through that gray space to get deals done, and or are deals just sort of on pause for the time being because of the gray space?
That's a great question. Having worked on, defaulted CMBS during the last downturn and probably transacted on 300 deals for various CMBS clients. I mean, they, on the CMBS side, they certainly have some issues right now that they're trying to sort through with deals as they default and what that does to the bond positions and a lot of other things. But, when you look at their space and then move it over towards deals, unlike say 2008, 2009, where you would have, a weekly watch list change that could be, 250, 300 properties just in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. This week it's at 75, and that's about $1.3 billion in assets, of which about 400 million of that is between two deals. And so, CMBS has their problems in certain food groups, but it's not the catastrophe that, we saw in 2008, 2009. So the good thing there is, we're not having lenders who are financially strapped or looking at insolvency in that space and in that world, trying to figure out how they're going to, survive going forward and having to burn through assets, especially on the disposition side. So when it comes to us transacting right now, we're, clients that typically sell with us have a reason to sell. It's not just churning inventory. And so then it's really just about managing expectations, especially if we have a dip of 5 to 10% on the LTV that's out there, although we hope it'll get better here in the near term. The one thing that we are seeing that is a positive is, and I know I mentioned it briefly in my commentary earlier, is the amount of dry powder that's on the sidelines. And because there's so much capital looking for assets, eventually the yield requirement that capital has is going to dip a little bit just for the sake of transacting. And, that's kind of what we expect is what's going to play out where, people were trying to get, say a 12 to a 14 unlevered, for value add stuff. Maybe they're going to go a little lower or they're going to be putting a little bit more equity out there. And so I think it's just going to become it's really just a function, I hate to say it, of, how long the gray area goes between the bid ask and sellers understanding that the world that we're in today is just not what it was back in January. And, for some people that's a problem, and they punt the opportunity hopefully into the next year and see if it plays out better. But for others, if they have to transact, we're just hoping that it's not a price change of more than 10%.
Barry, I'm gonna stay with you for a second, and then Michelle, you're on deck. But I'll pause for a second and just remind the audience that if you have questions, you can, I believe, throw them in the chat function, Shannon, if that's correct, and we'll pick them up as we see them. So one of the things that I find interesting is just on pricing, and this really probably relates to everybody, but since you're out there, Barry, in the market, looking at all different kinds of deals with a very wide array of market participants, when the 10 years at 60 basis points or 0.6%, and returns, whether it be debt or equity, get tied or anchored in a relatively low rate environment, has that just dragged down yield expectations altogether? Or are people stepping back and saying, if I don't get X, I'm just not doing this? And I'm curious what your perspective is on that, Barry.
Again, great question. It is, it's the answer to it is a function of what their risk tolerance is. So, when you look at Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, for better or worse, big picture to the national landscape, we're a flyover market, meaning when you come from New York, you go to Chicago, and then from there you head west. And
now, when I come from New York, I stop in Ann Arbor to go to a football game, if I can ever do that again. But
so, and what I mean when we put us in a flyover market is, the Midwest, again, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, does not have a flurry of transactions that are above 50 million. And so, we don't have the asset size or the asset value that plays heavily to the institutional capital that you would see in Denver, LA, or Texas, or other markets that have much bigger deals. So what happens in the Midwest component, to answer your question, is that people want to get a little bit better yield simply because of what the product is and where it's located. So inevitably, where this market always benefits is when the rest of the world gets very pricey, and you hear about 4 caps and 5 caps and West Coast markets, we tend to see an influx of capital here simply chasing yield because we're always priced a little higher than others. So I think it's really my price is my price kind of a thing. And now it's more a function of how bad did that deal do during COVID? Because it varies depending on which food group it's in. And then, what are the prospects for that asset going forward? And that's a big difference between bulk distribution to 200,000 feet of multi-tenant office to then a power center. So I think each food group has a totally separate answer as well.
Great. Michelle, as promised, I have a question for you. You had smiled when I mentioned what I wrote down on my notes is 50-50, meaning do we need more space or less space? And the answer was yes. So I'm curious what you're seeing around that, and whether or not that uncertainty is creating opportunities or sort of preventing them, meaning that, we're not sure if this tenant will renew, or we're not sure if demand in the market is going to fall off. Is that sort of paralyzing things for the time being? I'll just tell you one thing anecdotally. PwC is about to publish a study that was survey-based related to companies getting back to work. And the consensus was we may need more space as opposed to less. So I think it could be net more space. But I'm curious if that issue is really one that's creating paralysis in the decision-making processes out there about space.
Yeah, so we are still approving projects. We took a couple to our board last month. So it isn't as if it's paralyzed it in terms of that we aren't able to get transactions done. However, we do as mentioned, see opportunities, but also want to be careful, particularly in we provide critical, as Tasha mentioned in her remarks, we participate together in a lot of transactions, and soft money is critical to make a lot of the transactions work in the neighborhoods. And it's important that we are cautious in the investments that we are making, so that, particularly given that that pot isn't going up at the moment. So I think that we kind of have seen the gamut. We see some opportunities out there, but we also are being cautious, particularly with the new transactions that come in, so that we can make sure that the investments that we're making are most closely aligned with what the immediate needs of the community will be. And, and that can look a little different from market to market.
Got it. As I'm still awaiting questions in the 6 minutes we have left, I'll continue to ask them. Maybe these are questions that are on other people's minds. Tasha, and this actually, I'm going to break one of my rules and actually ask everybody the same question. And Tasha, I'm going to start with you. What's the hidden gem out there that is an opportunity for real estate investors that no one's really talking about?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I wish I had the secret sauce to that, because I probably would just move over to being a developer at this point in time. But I will say a couple of things. So to the comments that you made earlier about industrial space being an uptick in that, I think that's going to continue as a trend in our environment. One of the big projects that we just completed in Detroit that we're really excited about in the manufacturing space is My Locker, which was a $12 million expansion of a facility just recently, and is going to bring about 450 jobs to the city. So if we can prove out the point that manufacturing is a point of order for the city of Detroit, and we need to move into the design and manufacturing and fashion space, which is something that that creative economy, and having that designation in Detroit, that could be something that could be a hidden gem as we look at manufacturing, the design space. So, and what that looks like translates into real estate investments, I'm not exactly sure, but maybe that's one of the things that we think about.
Okay. I'm going to go back to you, Michelle, on that same question. Hidden gems out there that maybe people aren't focusing on.
Hidden gems, I guess the way I would answer this, would be to frame it more on just considering what we've seen in this time, in the COVID time, just in terms of future the potential for it to inform things around design and other aspects of a project that we that we think that the transactions that we do will continue, but maybe they will look a little different, and maybe there are some design lessons to be learned here. We've seen the communities that we work with throughout Michigan be very resilient in looking at what their local ordinances and codes are to really help be supportive of local business. And so I think there's like a lot of potential just in rethinking how the projects are done, and and what they might look like to sort of be more accommodating and more resilient, just with some of the lessons that we've learned through COVID.
Okay. Barry, I'll give you a final word as we're getting close to the end of the session. In canvassing the marketplace, debt, equity, is there anything that people aren't focusing on, perhaps, that they should be?
I mean, if I was a buyer, I think that there's going to be a level of pain associated with Class C multifamily once we get through July, and the tenant profile that's existing in that product is most likely going to have some difficulties tied to the crisis, and there may be opportunities with owners of that real estate to come in and participate in kind of a turnaround with those opportunities to help better serve the community. I think that's one. I think the other piece, certainly just speaking to Metro Detroit, is, industrial opportunities just in general. This is a market that had virtually no new supply even prior to the last downturn in '08. And industrial continues to diversify pretty heavily here, especially with the tech influx that has come to market here to service the auto industry for automation. So I think that's probably the other piece. And then lastly, depending on the strength of somebody purchasing and kind of their experience level, I think note sales are going to crop up as well, both on the CMBS side as well as with some other lenders to help kind of shuffle around exposure.
Okay. Well, I believe we're wrapping up, and I'm going to turn it over to Shannon. But Michelle, Tasha, and Barry, I thank you for your insights. I always enjoy visiting Detroit. At least I got an opportunity to do it virtually. I was going to wear a hat with a big block M on it, but I know that I'll probably offend a Michigan State person out there, so I didn't want to lower the attendance by offending somebody. But I thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to being back in Detroit sooner than later to meet with everybody again. And with that, I'm turning it back to you, Shannon.
Thanks so much, Mitch, Michelle, Tasha, and Barry. We really appreciate you spending time with us today. That was really informative and certainly less bleak than this conversation was about 30 days ago. So I'm happy that, we're kind of seeing things shift and people are able to focus more on the future. There are a couple of questions left that were essentially focused on sort of future rounds of stimulus, and we actually have plans to focus a future webinar on that as it gets approved. So look forward to that. We'll see you in 2 weeks where we will be talking about infrastructure and industrial real estate as sort of an emerging sector in Detroit. And look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, stay safe and enjoy the 4th of July holiday, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.